First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's discussion, a discovery of witchcraft, witches, witch hunting, and magic in the early modern period. I'd like to introduce you. My name is Dr. Justin Sledge. I teach philosophy and religion, and I work primarily in the intersection of philosophy and what is typically called esotericism, and that is the study of the more hidden or more occult aspects of history, philosophy, and religion. And so tonight we're going to be talking about, as I said, witches, witch hunting, and magic, which is, of course, I think a rather appropriate topic this time of the year. Certainly, this is the season of the witch, if there is any at all. So I'd like to say a couple of thanks just to begin before we begin the talk specifically. First of all, I'd really like to thank the Flint Institute of Arts for hosting this event. The Flint Institute of Arts, as I'm sure many folks know who are attending, is an amazing institution. I've worked with them on several occasions to provide lectures like this, and I'm always bowled away by the quality of the art there and the hospitality. It's just an amazing institution, and I'm deeply grateful to the FIA for the chance to give this lecture and this talk this evening. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to the people of Flint. You guys have been through so much, and you are going through so much, and you have triumphed. And I want to say that I have a special love for the people of Flint, and I'm just in awe of your tenacity and the face of the water crisis that has been heft upon you. And so I just want to acknowledge that great tragedy and really admire your tenacity in facing this great crime against y'all. Further, I'd like to also thank Dr. Alan Klein specifically for sponsoring the Sheppy Dog Lecture. As you may know, the Sheppy Dog Lecture was established by Dr. Alan Klein, and the Sheppy Dog Lecture enables the Flint Institute of Arts to present speakers addressing the topics of art, religion, and history prior to the 19th century. And it is because of the generous endowment of Dr. Alan Klein that I'm allowed to give this lecture this evening. So I want to really extend a very special thanks to him. I'd also like to welcome some of my YouTube subscribers and Patreon supporters who may be viewing on YouTube, and so other folks as well. So I really appreciate my esoterica people who are also watching tonight's lecture. So as I said, tonight's lecture is entitled A Discovery of Witchcraft, which as folks who know something about the witch trials will know, but that's a bit of a pun both on a television show, but also on an early modern document called The Discovery of Witchcraft, which itself was a bit of a skeptical document. But we're going to be discussing tonight witches, witch hunting, and magic in the early modern period. The two images you're seeing on the screen right now represent two distinct images of witches, one of which we may not recognize and one that we may recognize a bit better. On the left here, we can see the image of the witch that was perhaps the most terrifying in the early modern period. As you can see, we have here two alleged witches engaging in a type of magic, which is causing hail to fall from the sky. There was nothing more terrifying in the early modern period and the medieval period than the idea of witches being able to cause hail. And so the idea that the ability to cause hail could cause crop failure is deeply terrifying to many medieval people who relied on agriculture as their basic way of life. Of course, the other image on the right depicts what many of us know here from the image of the witch flying through the air to go to the Sabbath. You'll see there in the image the devil flying with both a male and female witch. Male witches were also sometimes known as warlocks, and we see here the very famous image of the witch's hat on the witch there in the foreground flying through the air with the witch's hat. I'm being told that there's a bit of a problem with the YouTube stream. I know that Heather is working behind the scenes to do some of the technical stuff. So Heather, I just got that through the chat, but there's a bit of a problem with the YouTube stream if you want to take a look at that, if you have a chance. Thank you so much. So again, two classic images of the witch. An image we recognize here with the witch flying through the air on a broom with the hat. And again, another image that would have been much more recognizable to a medieval person of a witch here causing hail to fall through magical means, and something, again, very terrifying. The witch is perhaps one of the most enduring ideas in civilization itself, not just Western civilization, but all of civilization. We have ideas of witches and witchcraft going all the way back to ancient Sumeria, the very earliest civilizations that we have in record. Um, and witches are depicted in every major work of art and literature, going back to the very beginning of art and literature. We have here depicted on the left the famous witch and sorceress Circe. And on the right here, we have an image that I think will be relatively familiar to most of you. This is an image of a witch flying through the air on a broom, although you'll notice here that she does not have the famous witch's hat. That hat, by the way, I'm happy to take questions about it later. It's not really clear exactly where that hat comes from, but here we have a pretty classic image of the witch flying through the air, and not just a classic image. This is in fact the first depiction of a witch on a broom flying through the air in history. This is the earliest depiction we have of a witch on a broom. This image is from a 1440 manuscript that is in fact a very long French poem. But you're looking at the very first time depicted in art, a witch flying through the air on a broom. But to be certain, the image of the witch reaches back to the very cradle of civilization, stretches into the Greek and Roman period, all the way through the Middle Ages, and until now, where I'm sure if we were doing trick-or-treating, you would have a couple of little witches coming to your house to request candy. So the idea of the witch is perhaps one of the most enduring tropes in art, in literature, and in history. So it is not surprising that when we think about the image of the witch, we should be unsurprised that this is such a powerful image indeed. As I said, right, the witch is bearing the brunt of about 5,000 years of what I would call overdetermination. When we think about the witch, we can't quite imagine exactly what she or he is, primarily she, because so much of history has rolled into this conception. You're seeing here on the left a cuneiform tablet that dates from the Neo-Assyrian period. It's roughly about the 8th or 9th century, the 7th century of the BCE, in fact. The text you're looking at is what is called the Maklu document. This is a series of anti-witch incantations, which is interesting, right? This is a form of anti-witch magic that was developed during the Neo-Assyrian period and was probably one of the longest enduring month-long celebrations in that calendar, typically happening in what we would now consider August. So it's very difficult to actually understand precisely what the witch is, because so much of stereotype, so much of prejudice, so much of historical accumulation has been laid upon the concept of the witch that we have a very difficult time understanding just what the witch was and just what the witch did, if the witch in fact existed at all. So the task tonight is to look at a very specific period of the witch. That is to say, we're going to look at a specific image of the witch and witchcraft and witch persecution that occurred primarily in Europe during the early modern period. But as far back as the Code of Hammurabi, there are in fact anti-witchcraft laws that occurred as far back as that period. Although what's interesting about the Code of Hammurabi is that if one accuses someone of witchcraft, there are no specific laws against witchcraft, but if one accuses someone of witchcraft and you fail to meet that accusation, one is in fact punished for failing to meet that accusation. We will see that that is a very important idea that is suspended in early modern Europe, and that will contribute greatly to the explosion of the witch trials in early modern Europe. So it's there that we turn. Despite the fact that we typically think of early modern Europe or medieval Europe as primarily an intensely Christian culture, magic absolutely flourished. I know that it's a weird thing to say, that when most people think of the Middle Ages, they primarily think of an intensely intensely Catholic culture where something like the Inquisition would immediately crack down on anything like magic or superstition or something like that. What we're learning as we're beginning to do scholarship in the 19th and early 20th century up till now is that what we're learning is that magic absolutely thrived during the medieval period, and it thrived at every level of society. We have, and in fact, it thrived at every level of society. And there were various forms of magic that one could practice in medieval Europe if you were so inclined to. Magic was thriving among the peasants, and it also thrived at the very levels of the top elites, including many priests. We'll talk about this idea in just a moment. So many Catholic priests are in fact responsible for many of the magical ideas that we have from the medieval magical period. So this would include a wide range of magical practices. We have a great deal of what we might call white magic or healing magic. We have what we would call natural magic. This would be something like a kind of proto-science. This was practiced, for instance, by people like Roger Bacon, who studied what they thought were the magical properties or the occult properties of stones to uncover their magical properties. This would include also what is called astral magic or astrological magic that was imported primarily through the Islamic lands of Spain and the Islamic world. And this would also include black magic, what we might call necromancy or demonic magic. What is perhaps most interesting about demonic magic or necromancy, black magic, is that the primary people that were practicing that form of magic would be priests, that is to say, members of the clergy. Now, I know you might be thinking, they're Catholics, they're priests, they're Christians. How could they be practicing black magic? Well, things get very interesting in this regard. It's, as you might imagine, the kind of people capable of reading, writing, doing rituals, the kind of people that would know the exact kind of rituals that would invoke the power of God, the kind of people that would know how to invoke the power of angels and therefore demons would be, well, none other than Catholic priests. And so many of the necromantic or black magic documents we have from the Middle Ages, we're fairly confident were written by priests. And I say fairly confident because, well, we have priests telling us that other priests are practicing black magic in the Middle Ages. John of Salisbury, a very famous Catholic theologian of the early Middle Ages, in fact tells us that as a child, he was actually used in a black magic ritual by his Latin teacher and a priest. So we have some basic ideas that a great deal of magic was being practiced in the Middle Ages at all levels of society and by all registers of religious belief. I'll also say this includes Jewish magic. And of course, Jews represent a very tiny minority of the population in Europe, but Jewish magic also thrived during this period. I've in fact taught entire classes on just the history of Jewish magic, and we have numerous Jewish magical texts that survive from this period, not just Christian texts, but also Jewish texts as well. This was so significant that the University of Paris actually had to pass a decree in September of 1398, around this time of the year, telling their students to stop practicing black magic. So you can imagine there's something very hilarious about this idea that the University of Paris has to issue a decree, it's like sending out a mass email, saying, "Dear students of the University of Paris Sorbonne, please stop practicing black magic. You're supposed to be good Catholics. This is forbidden. You should not be allowed to do this." So one doesn't send out condemnation letters like that in the way that they did, unless one has the idea of black magic being practiced in the University of Paris. So we have really interesting ideas here that we have a really interesting circumstance that black magic was clearly being practiced. If you're curious about the document there on the right, this is a necromancer's manual. That is to say, a black magic manual that was published or written down sometime around 1450 in the midst of the witch hunts, which we'll talk about in just a moment, somewhere in Germany. This black magic manual, which is very fascinating, contains all kinds of spells for turning invisible, for making people fall in love with you, for summoning castles, for resurrecting the dead. And we have very little doubt that this was in fact written by a member of the clergy. What you're seeing on the page right now are various kinds of symbols for summoning spirits representing the various planets, Saturn, Jupiter, etc., in order to perform astrological magic. So here we have a small page of a document from a black magician's manual, a necromancer's manual from about 1450. So here we have two different distinct forms of magic being practiced in Europe. On the left, you can see the image of a classical necromancer. This is a black magician. You can see what I imagine most of you would recognize as a magical practice. He has here the sword and the magical circle surrounding him with various occult symbols. You can see various objects of treasure there inside the circle, along with a demon, which is not terribly well preserved there just to his right, in which he's using a sword in order to summon that demon. The use of the sword persists to this day in magical practices. And so we can see here that this idea goes back to the very early Middle Ages. This document here is actually written in Middle English. On the right-hand side, we see what is called a witch bottle. This would have been an idea, this would have been a magical practice used by what we would call cunning folk. These are folk magicians or folk practitioners who would practice magic in what we might consider an unlearned way. Although I don't like that distinction between learned and unlearned, as if common working class peasant people are somehow unlearned. I dislike that distinction. I find it to be problematic in lots of regards. But here what we have is a witch bottle that has been recovered in England. And inside of it, you can see various kinds of pins. Sometimes these bottles contain urine, which is a pretty common magical fluid. And here we have various kinds of pins that are plugged. And this bottle was actually, in fact, filled with urine and was used probably to hex someone. You can see the amount of nails. As you may know, nails were quite expensive in the medieval period. In the use of nails, although we think of nails as something you can go to Home Depot and get, nails were relatively expensive in the Middle Ages. And the use of these nails were almost certainly meant to hex or to punish someone via the use of this magical bottle, this witch bottle that was used by what we would call the cunning folk of medieval England. Every region of Europe had what we might call the cunning folk, that is to say, folk practitioners of magic who used magical means to accomplish various kinds of tasks, both black magic and white magic. So I want to make a distinction here, but not a sharp distinction, between learned necromancers here on the left and folk magicians on the right. In some degree, that idea still persists to this day in the form of ceremonial magic practiced by modern occultists and folk magic practiced in various other areas. Although I find this distinction a bit problematic, as do many scholars, and I want to point out here that these the more folkish practitioners were in fact very learned. They had a great deal of herbal knowledge. They had a great deal of astrological knowledge, even though they perhaps weren't literate. Of course, as I'm sure all of you know, literacy, of course, is not the only measure of knowledge. The early prosecutions that we have during the witch trials are primarily actually targeted at men. This would be in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries primarily. The early anti-sorcery prosecutions are mostly targeted at men, and they mostly take a political character. That is to say, it's mostly someone being enraged that they were targeted politically by kind of magic. We should also note this is during the period of the persecution of the Cathars, the Waldensians, and the Knights Templar. I think many folks may know who they were. These were heretics living in southern France at the time. But this also was a period of prolonged theological shift. In the theology developing in scholasticism at this time, we have a shift in the understanding of just what magic was. Rather than magic simply being a normal sin, like adultery or theft or murder perhaps, what ends up happening is that magic becomes a kind of sin that in order to accomplish magic, one must make a pact with a demon or a devil, and that pact almost always includes the idea of undermining Christianity and undermining all of Christendom. And so rather than sorcery becoming a normal kind of sin, like stealing, we have sorcery becoming a kind of heretical idea, that by becoming a sorcerer or becoming a witch, one is not just guilty of a crime of sin, one is in fact trying to undermine all of Christianity by joining into the league of the devil himself. So as you might imagine, right, the idea of the covenant, the idea that Christ established a new covenant with Christians was a very powerful idea in Christianity. And the idea that if you sign or declare a pact with the devil, then clearly you are attempting to undermine Christendom. And overall, this idea where you meld together the idea of sorcery and heresy and the idea that you're undermining all of Christendom by becoming in league with the devil, this new sin is sometimes referred to as diabolism. You can see here a young gentleman using the power of astrology here, the sun and the stars, to summon a demon here on the left from a medieval manuscript. This is an interesting depiction of summoning a demon within a magical circle using astrological power. This very much reflects the idea of demonic summoning by a so-called learned magician during this period. This uniting of the idea of sorcery and heresy, but not just sorcery and heresy, but heresy as a kind of corporate task, right? That when you become a magician, you're not just committing a sin, but you're engaging in not just heresy, but a heresy which seeks to undermine all of Christendom, is a dramatic transition in the understanding of magic as an idea in Western Europe in the high Middle Ages. This primarily occurs in the 13th century. And it's during this period that we begin to see the first prosecutions of a non-political character. So the earliest person we have, one of the earliest people we have executed during this transitional period is Alice Kittler. Alice Kittler was an Irish woman who was executed for witchcraft, who was a prosecutor and eventually prosecuted for witchcraft. And we have a gentleman named Stedelin, who was executed for witchcraft in 1397 in Switzerland. Switzerland is going to become one of the hotbeds for witchcraft prosecution during the early modern period. And it's through this period that we begin the slow march to building up the composite idea of the witch, right? So prior to this, we have sorcerers and perhaps sorceresses, but we have increasingly a transition from the idea of the sorcerer reading a book to summon a demon to the idea of the witch selling her soul in order to get power, therefore joining the league of the devil himself. And that process begins primarily to begin happening in the 15th century through the 16th century. And it's then through that long period, about 200 years, that we begin to see the basic elements of the so-called witch. And I'm going to use the word witch here in scare quotes for reasons that will be relatively clear here in just a moment. But those basic ideas of witchcraft would include something like the pact with the devil, the flight to the Sabbath or the Sabbath, right? You can already hear the idea of the going to the Sabbath as having a kind of anti-Semitic overtone to it, right? The Sabbath being a Jewish idea. There's an anti-Semitic element here as well. The idea of infantile cannibalism, the idea that witches would kidnap, torture, and kill children or infants. The idea of mass sexual sin was a very core component of witchcraft in this time period. The idea that you would gather at the Sabbath and you would engage in sexual sin, either with other witches or with the devil himself or with various demons. This would include the famous hideous kiss, where one would seal the deal with the devil by kissing the devil on his buttocks. This would also include the idea of the devil's mark, that you would sign the book of the devil and the devil would mark your body and seal your body in a certain way to show that you were in fact surrendered yourself to the devil. This idea of the devil's mark would be that this area would be cold and witch hunters would prick this area and show that you were inhuman, right? That you couldn't feel pain in that area. You would bleed from that area and that showed that you had surrendered yourself to the devil. And of course, the most important aspect of it all, you would become a conspirator in the anti-Christian army engaged in sorcery to undermine and destroy all of Christendom. And it is also during this period that we have the first anti-witchcraft manuals or inquisitorial manuals being written that one would hunt out witches. The most basic text here coming from about 1437. This is the Formicarius, or the anthill, which you're seeing here on the right-hand side in a printed form, an early printed form. in which the idea here by Johann Schneider, you have the earliest document describing the so-called crime of witchcraft. It's also this time period that we have accelerations in the law that allow the witch hunts to begin. We have a transition which is very important here in the early Middle Ages, where rather than having an accusatorial situation where individual people accuse other people and then you have a trial by ordeal, what we have rather is a trial by judges in an inquisitorial process. So we have a transition in the very way the law is done. This centralizes the legal system of the Middle Ages, and we have a system in which, rather than simply having trial by ordeal, which we'll talk about in just a moment, we have the idea of trial by inquisition. And this is going to centralize in many ways the juridical and the legal system of the Middle Ages. Now, on the one hand, this is going to accelerate in the early period, the witch trials, but in the later period, it's actually going to slow the witch trials down in a very important and interesting way. It's important to note also that by 1215, the Catholic Church itself rejected what is called the trial by ordeal. So I know that it's very likely that many of you have heard of the idea of dipping a witch in water to determine whether or not she is in fact a witch. What's important to note about that procedure, as horrifying as it is the church itself, the Catholic Church, forbid that exact mechanism of testing a witch by 1215. So in any case in which a witch, a so-called witch, was tested by an ordeal by water, by swimming the witch or dipping her in water, that was already forbidden officially in Catholic law by 1215. It is mostly lynch mobs that carried out that kind of so-called trial in the medieval period and the early modern period. What's also noticeable about the transitions of the law in this period is that witchcraft itself, or maleficium, is transitioned from just being a sin to being a crime. As you might imagine, the idea of witchcraft in which you join in a pact with the devil to undermine Christianity would be understood as not just a religious crime, but a secular crime, because many kings and authorities understood themselves as regents, co-regents with the divine, and they had their authority on the basis of divine right. So if you were trying to undermine Christianity or perceived as trying to undermine Christianity, you would also be perceived as being basically a kind of revolutionary or basically a kind of a traitor to the state. And so we have the transition in which witchcraft is understood not just as a heresy, but as a secular form of treason, a crimum exceptum, an exceptional crime like treason or like sedition. And because it was understood at this period as a crimum exceptum or a treasonous crime, one could be subject to torture to discover it. Of course, the development and the implementation of torture during this period is going to greatly accelerate the witch trials because, of course, what the CIA learned during the recent Iraq War is that if you torture someone, they will admit to practically anything. I'm pretty sure if you tortured me, I would admit to being the Queen of England. And so it doesn't take much torture for many people to admit that they have done practically anything. What's also important in this period, right, is I want to talk about the reality of bureaucracy and how important bureaucracy is. If you have a legal system in which there are no appellate courts, once you're sentenced to death, you die. But in more developed legal systems, for instance, legal systems that are found actually ironically in the Inquisition, if you're subject to the death penalty, your case was immediately appealed in many situations to a higher court. In many courts, including inquisitional courts, right? I know all of us, many of us think of the Inquisition as a torturous, horrifying institution. And in many ways that was true, especially for conversos, people who had converted from Judaism to Christianity. But in areas in which the Inquisition was very powerful, executions for witchcraft actually were lower than other comparable regions, primarily because they had appellate courts. So, if, for instance, in Paris, where there was a very powerful appellate court, the witchcraft trials were much lower than in rural regions of France, in which there was a thinner layer of bureaucracy. Now, I know that no one likes to stand in line at the DMV to get a license, but if you're accused of witchcraft, bureaucracy may be, in some sense, your best friend. the power of appellate courts had so much to do with slowing down the process of witchcraft persecutions. What's also important to note during this time period is that witch hunting and the idea of witch hunting primarily developed in literature, which was greatly accelerated through printing at this time. There's no way to understand the early modern witch hunts without understanding printing. Printing greatly accelerated the spread of the ideas behind so-called witchcraft. And what we have here is a very terrifying feedback loop in which demonologists or witch hunters would formulate an idea of witchcraft. That book would be printed. You would buy it. You perhaps would go and hunt witches in a rural area. You would torture people, unfortunately. They would confess to exactly what you were asking them because you were asking them leading questions, and then yet would affirm what the books were saying. And you begin to get a feedback loop between the literature of the witch hunters and the experience of the actual witch hunters on the ground, in which confessions almost always arrived through torture, specifically strappado torture. Strappado torture is where your arms are tied behind your back and you're lifted into the air and you're bounced up and down in order to induce a great deal of pain into the joints of your shoulders. This was the most common form of torture used to extract confessions against so-called witches. What we have here is a kind of feedback loop between witch hunters, right, and witch publishers. And because torture was introduced at various levels of European society, when you torture people and you ask them leading questions like, did you fly to the Sabbath? Did you did you kiss the devil in his rear end? Did you curse these people? After a torture, you would confess, and we have a feedback loop between the literature of the demonologist and the confessions, and this could get out of control, as you might imagine, incredibly quickly. This literature was produced by both Catholics and Protestants, and we have a great deal of this literature being produced. I've listed some of the names here in the slide. While most of you may know the very famous 1486 Malleus Maleficarum, the so-called Hammer of Witches, there were dozens of witch hunting manuals and witch discovery manuals and so-called demonological literature produced from roughly 1450 to about 1700. In fact, the Malleus Maleficarum, despite the fact that it is most well known, was not the most well used witch hunting manual in Protestant lands. That document was written by Karpzov. Karpzov was a German, although originally born in Poland, but a German witch hunter, and he wrote a very famous document that became basically the Malleus Maleficarum of Protestant lands. Martin de Rio also wrote what is probably, in fact, the most popular demonological text of the 17th century, the high point of the witch trials themselves. So we have an enormous literature. And again, printing is very important here. It's very important to understand that the power of the printed word, people generally thought that if people printed things, they weren't wrong. And the idea of the written word, the idea of these texts being disseminated through printing, very clearly tell us that witchcraft was a terrifying reality for many people. And we can also track, by the way, in the intensity of witch hunts by the printing of these various books at various times. So when printing drops, witch hunting drops, and when printing rises, we can see evidence of greater witch hunting. Now the question, of course, is it chicken and the egg? Does the reprinting cause more witch hunting, or does witch hunting demand more printing? And the answer is probably both. Now, none of these documents capture the entirety of the idea of the witch. For instance, many documents will leave out the idea of the famous witch's flight to the Sabbath, or the idea of the devil's mark. Although the composite, right? Everyone's reading all of these books, and from that composite, one would, if one were a witch hunter or deeply afraid of so-called witches, one could develop this idea. The witch trials reached their most horrifying intensity from about 1550 to about 1650. It's during that time period that we have an enormous amount of people, almost overwhelmingly women, being accused of witchcraft and executed during this period. We'll talk about numbers as we understand them in just a moment. This image I find to be deeply horrifying because this image was perhaps drawn from life. And when we're looking at these women here, we're looking at women that were perhaps drawn from life, and at least drawn at some level from life. And these women were greatly tortured and burned, sometimes alive, although most frequently they were strangled before they were burned. Very few women were in fact burned alive. In fact, you can see there on the witch, so-called witch there on the bottom left, she still has the garrote around her neck. Um, for someone who understands the horrors, for instance, of the Nazi Holocaust, the idea of burning these innocent women alive is profoundly and deeply horrifying. So I think that when we think about the witch trials and we look at an image like this, we should have some degree of reverence and some degree of somber reflection that so many of these women were accused of basically a non-crime, subject to torture, and then executed in some of the most embarrassing and horrifying ways imaginable. So what do we know about these so-called witches, right? And again, I put the word witches here in scare quotes because I don't think that we know much about these women, and we don't know much about them as witches because I think the data will tell us that there probably weren't much in the way of witches, at least as the way these men. And again, we cannot separate the reality of misogynistic violence from the reality of the witch trials. What we do know from the data is that these women, that the vast majority of so-called witches were women. This is in excess of about 75%. Although in some areas, specifically in Iceland and in Russia, it's weirdly there. These areas are weirdly an exception. For instance, in Iceland, only 8% of the people executed in Iceland were witches, or rather were women. Only 8% of the witches executed in Iceland were women. So Iceland and Russia proved to be strange exceptions to this rule. Why women? The first major idea we must acknowledge is, as I mentioned a moment ago, medieval misogyny. There was a deep idea in the Middle Ages that women were maybe not inferior, but they were in fact weaker. And the idea that they were weaker was that they were weaker both spiritually and morally, and therefore more susceptible to the temptation of the devil. And so we have a basic idea of medieval misogyny that functions directly into the witch trials. We should also look at the social location of women. Women at this time were primarily child rearers, they were midwives, and they were healers. That is to say, they had access to children, specifically babies. Most men had very little access, especially to babies, and much of the slander of the witch trials was that these women were kidnapping and torturing and killing babies as part of their so-called rituals. It's also the case that women were the primary healers in many villages and many townships in the Middle Ages. That is to say, it was women who understood the herbs and the various kinds of healing mechanisms that would have been used in many medieval locations to engage in the healing process of the community. Well, if one can heal someone, one can also poison someone. And so we have also the reality of cooks. Women were also engaged primarily in cooking and the gender roles of the Middle Ages. And so between the idea of healers and cooks, there was the constant threat of the idea that they were also engaging in poisoning as well. Also, right, we have the idea of social powerlessness. Women were, as you might imagine, through the Middle Ages and the early modern period, quite socially powerless in many ways. And it may be the case that they were perceived, or perhaps they did, engage in attempting to gather power via witchcraft or sorcery. Either they did or they were perceived as doing it. We may talk about more in just a moment. Witches were, alleged witches, as we know them from the data, were almost overwhelmingly over the age of 50. There was something about post-menopausal women that deeply terrified men. Again, this has to do with the misogynistic view of women at this time, who were primarily understood as either child bearers or child rearers, and menopausal women were understood with some degree of suspicion by men at this time. They were in many cases, they were unmarried, although almost often widowed. And they were typically poor, although they did own some land. We do have many cases of women owning land, and many of the cases of these witches, so-called witches being accused, owned small tracts of land. Furthermore, what we have for many of the witch trials is that many of the women accused of witchcraft, especially early on in these sort of chain reaction hunts that we have from this time period, were basically socially unliked. They were either perceived as gossipers, they were known to be people that cursed. Cursing in the Middle Ages was thought of as a, let's say using curse words, right? This was thought of as a very bad sin for women. Sometimes these women were alcoholics. This is also perceived as a very terrible sin for women in the Middle Ages. And what we can tell from many of the so-called confessions of this time period, that we can see that from many of the confessions that we have that have survived, that many of these women are suffering from what we now call mental illness and senility. Again, this only adds to the horror of the witch trials, in which many women in this case are suffering from profound mental illness and senility, mental disability, and it is deeply terrifying and horrifying that these women would be targeted and manipulated into confessing that they were witches and executed for these grounds. Here you can see on the left an image of a drawn from life image from an English witchcraft trial. You can see here that two of these women, the woman here on the left, Ann Baker, is clearly blind, right? She's blind. She has a stick for helping her with her blindness. They all have familiar animals, demonic animals nearby. You can see here Joan Willamette. She walks with crutches, and the woman on the left, Ellen Green, is also blind. Her eyes are shut. And so here we see, I think, a very accurate depiction of the kind of women that were accused of witchcraft during this time period. These are among the most vulnerable members of early modern and medieval life. These are disabled women, often suffering from physical or mental disability, who are accused and found guilty of witchcraft and executed. Again, only adding to the deep horror of this time period. The question is whether there were witches at all, right? Were there witches? Were there people who did the things that demonologists claimed? The answer is we have no evidence at all of child infanticide. We have no evidence at all of women gathering in large numbers to worship the devil. We have no evidence at all of basically anything that the men in charge of the witch trials accused these women of engaging in. There basically is no evidence of it. And I say no evidence of it, we have no one that can testify to women gathering in the woods in the middle of the night to worship the devil. Someone would have come upon one of these gatherings in the over 400 years of these trials, and we basically have no evidence of it. It seems as if the witch, the idea of the witch, at least depicted in the demonological literature of this time period, existed exclusively in the mind of men witch hunters. Now, were there women that engaged in magic? Probably, right? We know of a great deal of magical practices that were practiced during this time period, and it's very likely that women were engaging in various kinds of magical practices, and it's possible that some of these magical practices were inherited from pre-Christian Europe. But again, many of the women prosecuted for witchcraft are not accused primarily of specifically magical practices. They're primarily accused of engaging in covenantal pacts with the devil, which again, we have very little evidence at all, with one exception. The one exception of this is women who knew about the idea of witchcraft, who were profoundly impoverished. And in those cases, we do have a few reliable confessions, not achieved by torture, in which some of these women did attempt to make a pact with the devil in order to alleviate their basically intolerable social situation. In those cases, we have them admitting to the idea of trying to make a pact with the devil, failing, the devil didn't show up, and them becoming deeply grievous of the fact that the devil did not in fact show up, and then becoming very apologetic for trying to have done this at all. But again, this represents a weird situation in which the demonologists are creating an idea, women are buying into the idea, trying to sell their soul because they're so poor and so destitute, failing, being caught up in the witch trials, confessing to this, and then ultimately recanting, sometimes on the scaffold and sometimes despite the fact they were executed, sadly. So if there were witches in the early modern period, they were very likely the production of the demonologists rather than the actual voluntary action of the witches themselves. The image here on the left is a pretty classic image of a witch depicted from about 1720. We have her here gathering herbs from the forest in order to engage allegedly in various kinds of witchcraft. So we have here this image of what a witch would have appeared to someone in about 1720. What would a witch trial have actually looked like? There were various kinds of triggers in the early modern period and in the Middle Ages about what would have triggered a witch trial. In almost all circumstances, it would have been something like a calamity. So a fire, a hailstorm, sometimes war triggered, in many cases, witch trials. Various kinds of things led to witch trials. And what would end up happening is a death of an infant or cattle, and even sometimes romantic failure. It's very important to realize that in many cases, men would be rejected by a woman, and in their rejection of that romantic interest, what would end up happening is that they would accuse the woman of bedeviling them and turning them away. So again, we have this idea that what's going on is that again, most of this is at some level being motivated by men. Now, what's important about the trial itself is that everything depends on exactly the legal mechanism by which the trial took place. If accusations came from below, from common people, they would be kicked up to a local judge, and then depending on exactly the mechanism of how that judge operated, for instance, if that judge used torture or not, or if confessions were the most important thing, or if there was an appellate process, or if there just was a lynch mob, the various mechanisms in various parts of Europe ultimately determined exactly how the witch trial would go. And so it was very important whether or not one was accused of being a witch by local peasants or by your local community, or if one was accused by being a witch by an inquisitional judge. And again, this all depended on how the situation would go, depending on exactly the mechanisms by which the juridical procedure would go. For instance, in England, torture was basically prohibited, although it did occur in a minority of cases, whereas, for instance, in Germany, there was a great deal of torture that was accomplished. You can see here on the right an example of torture being applied to a woman in the 16th century. We have here an example of strappato torture, where the woman is being lifted into the air in a form of torture. And we have another alleged witch waiting in the wings, unfortunately, to be tortured herself. These weights here would be applied to the feet of the woman. You can see here a weight of the tie applied to the foot of the woman. And we have a lashing tool here to inflict pain upon the alleged witch in order to get her to confess. This idea of achieving a confession was very much an important part of the juridical procedure of this kind of law. Despite the fact that the witch trials were a pan-European phenomenon, there was an enormous variation in how witchcraft trials happened and the perception of the witch in various areas. For instance, in Germany, which represented Germany, which was at that time the Holy Roman Empire, and the nearby regions represented nearly 75% of the total witch hunts that existed in Europe during this time period. And again, you can see that the fact that the Holy Roman Empire was composed of so many tiny little states, there was no robust system of checks and balances. And because there was no robust system of checks and balances, these witch trials could become extraordinarily chain reactionary in a very terrifying way. As I mentioned earlier, in some cases, you have areas in which overwhelmingly it's men that are prosecuted for witchcraft, for instance, in Iceland and Russia. And in some areas, there are very specific forms of witchcraft. In England, for instance, torture was not allowed. But one of the really interesting ideas we find in England is the idea of the familiar. The familiar, of course, is the idea that the witch would have with them a kind of demonic animal that would assist them in their process of witchcraft. Here we have an illustration from a famous witch hunt led by Matthew Hopkins, which Matthew Hopkins was one of the most famous witch hunters in English history. We have several different two different witches here, alleged witches that are depicted, and we have the various familiars that are named as the demonic helpers that they had. We have this weird dog character here who is known as Vinegar. We have a rabbit known as Sack and Sugar. These various kinds of Peck in the Crown was another name of one of these familiars. This dog here is called Jamara. What's interesting about this dog is that he had no legs, apparently, according to the so-called confession of the alleged witch there on the left. So familiars were a typical idea found in English witchcraft, but they weren't found, for instance, in other places on the continent. So again, there's an enormous amount of regional variation in the way that witchcraft is perceived, in the way that witchcraft is prosecuted. For instance, in England, witchcraft was not prosecutable via torture, but in Scotland it was. And in Scotland, for instance, we have an enormously high degree of witchcraft cases that break out there in Scotland. So while Scotland and England were attached, witchcraft trials are much higher in Scotland than in England, primarily because of the use of torture there in Scotland. This period also represents a transition in the evolution of magic itself. We have to understand that we're going through what we might call the Renaissance at this time, and magic is also changing in this way as well. It's not like magic stays the same. It's in this period that we actually have a transition from demonic magic to a kind of magic in which one can remain a Christian and engage in magic at the same time. We see here on the right one of a early printing from the 3 books on occult philosophy by Cornelius Agrippa, himself a very pious Christian, despite slander to the contrary. In this new form of magic that develops primarily in Italy in the 15th century, magic transitions in some sense from the summoning of demons to accomplish one's ends to the idea that magic is a way of elevating one's soul to union with the divine. So magic is the idea that one can elevate one's soul, and in the process of elevating one's soul toward the divine, one gains greater and greater, almost divine-like powers over nature. And these powers over nature give one the ability to manipulate nature in accordance to one's desires at some level. And this period, in the midst of the witch trials, sees an explosion in a completely new theory of magic. The images here we're seeing are the images of various magical symbols representing the planets, found again in the works of Cornelius Agrippa. And it's during Renaissance, the Renaissance and early modern period, that we have a complete transition in the theory of magic as well. Now, you might be asking, why didn't these men get prosecuted for magic if they were engaged in this kind of new kind of magic? Well, some of them did face something like prosecution, and some of them didn't. Many of them didn't. And the idea was, even if they're engaged in this new kind of magic, they weren't making pacts with the devil to undermine all of Christianity. That, again, was the exclusive purview of some level of witchcraft, right? One of the most interesting forms of magic that emerges in this period, and a form of magic that I have a lot of interest in, was developed by Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly. He was a British magician, primarily living in England in the 16th century. Through the 1580s, Dr. Dee contacted, through his medium, Edward Kelly, an enormous amount of spirits, angels, demons. And these angels and demons revealed to Dee and Kelly, allegedly, all kinds of things, including alchemical secrets, apocalyptic writings, even a complex system of magic for further invoking other kinds of angels, including a complete language. And I say a complete language, I mean a language. You're seeing here on the screen here on the left an early printed copy of some of Dr. John Dee's diaries. The symbols here that you're seeing in the middle and along the borders are the alphabets of a language called Enochian. This language was revealed allegedly by these angels, and this language contains nouns, verbs, conjugation, syntax, entire prayers actually written in this language that were revealed allegedly to Dr. John Dee and Edward Kelly through the process of their evocations of these beings. We have a great deal of Dr. John Dee's writings. 2 substantial volumes are thus in print. And even curiously enough, the angels actually commanded Dee and Kelly to swap wives, to have their wives in common, to use the language of the so-called angels. Um, and these angels alleged to have their wives in common. And from the diary, we can tell that they did, in fact, swap wives and, in fact, slept with each other's wives sexually to achieve this alleged angelic mandate. And so, this form of magic, so called Enochian magic, from the 1580s remains one of the most fascinating forms of magic that developed during this time period, again, in the midst of the high point of the witch trials. Despite all this, there were skeptics, right? Many people doubted the reality of the enormity of witchcraft during this time period. And as early as the 10th century, we have even people doubting that witches can travel magically through the air to join at the so-called witches' sabbat. And we would have people as early as 1563, like Johann Weyer, saying, look, I don't think that there are such things as witches, or maybe there are witches, but the people being prosecuted are suffering from what he called melancholia, what we would now call mental illness. Reginald Scott, as early as 1584, argued that witchcraft was mostly trickery, what we would call stage magic. And Alonso de Salazar Frias actually argued that the journey to the Sabbath was in fact dreams, that women were simply having dreams, and that no evidence arrived at by torture would be considered valid, that torture was simply an invalid mechanism for achieving reliable evidence in trials. You may be wondering exactly how many people were prosecuted and murdered during the witch trials. Our best estimates, as we can tell, are about 90,000 to 100,000 prosecutions from roughly about 1450 to about 1750. And what we think is that between 45,000 and 60,000 people, mostly women, overwhelmingly women, were executed during the entirety of the witch trials as we know them. If you're curious about our neck of the woods, the New World, there were about 40 cases prosecuted in the southern regions of the colonies, with one execution in Maryland in 1685. There were, however, 21 prosecutions in Bermuda, in the Caribbean, with, again, one execution during the period of the colonial period. And there were 234 prosecutions in New England, resulting in 36 executions. And this includes the very famous Salem witch trials, which resulted in 19 executions, 18 of which were women and one of which was a man. Just to get an idea of the enormity of this is about 100,000 people living in the colonial America at this time. And you get some sense of the enormity. In fact, colonial North America produced more prosecutions for witchcraft than did Scotland, which was significantly higher than England at the time. So we're looking at somewhere between 45,000 and 60,000 people, mostly women, executed from about 1450 to about 1750 during the high point of the witch trials. Let me check the time just for a moment. All right, we're just about to wrap up and enter into some questions and answers if you guys are interested. The witch hunts didn't begin all of a sudden, and they didn't end all of a sudden either. There was a great deal of social changes that occurred throughout the period of the witch trials that resulted in a decline and eventually an end of the witch trials. And this would include everything from the forbidding of torture as a juridical mechanism to changes in evidence, for instance, and the admission of what is called spectral evidence. Spectral evidence would be something like, I saw you in a dream cavorting with a devil. That would be admitted as evidence in many witch trials. During this time period, many judges began to forbid the use of spectral evidence. This is also the time period during the rise of what we would now call natural philosophy or science. Galileo, of course, in 1610, would turn his telescope toward the heavens and for the first time see the moons of Jupiter there again in January of 1610. And this is also the time period of the emergence of the scientific mindset. And that emergence also had a great impact on the learned people of England. And that mindset also had a very dramatic impact of the idea of of witchcraft, right? Because again, if you're turning your direction toward skepticism, one would see, in fact, that well, a skeptical attitude doesn't produce much in the way of witchcraft. Also, we have the rise of humanist biblical interpretation. That is to say, people began to read the Bible in the original languages, and the original languages disrupted the idea that one could simply kill witches on sight. We have the very famous verse that justified a great deal of witchcraft, Exodus 22:17, that one must kill all witches. There was a great deal of transition and understanding just what that verse meant. And also, we have to understand that in the end period of the witch trials, life simply got better for many Europeans. That is to say, during the time period of the witch trials, we were in the period of what is called the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age was a period of a drop in global temperature, and that period resulted in enormous amounts of crop failure. There was a very high degree of inflation in the 17th century, and this time period resulted in a great deal of adversity socially, including war, and war, social, and ecological adversity precipitated a great deal in the terms of the witch hunts. So this begins to come to an end, and as it begins to come to an end, things begin to get significantly better. It's worth noting that the last woman executed legally for witchcraft was in Switzerland, one of the areas in which the witch trials began. Anna Godley was executed by decapitation on the 13th of June, 1782. Her execution at that time was widely condemned by many people, including other jurists, as completely out of control. And Anna Godley was executed there, and many jurists thought that this was out of control and was considered to be widely condemned by many other people at this time. Although she would not be the last person executed for witchcraft, there was an extrajudicial killing of a Polish woman in 1783. And what's interesting is that the border exactly between Poland at that time, it wasn't clear who was in control. And the judge at that time used the fact that who wasn't in control to basically execute a woman for witchcraft during this time. But Anna Godley is typically considered to be the last woman to be executed by witchcraft at this time. If you're curious, the Dutch were the first or the last to both try and execute women for witchcraft in Europe. It was the Dutch. And the last witchcraft trial that occurred in North America was in 1692, 1693 during the so-called Salem witch hunts. The witch endures, folks. And I'm beginning to wrap up. I don't want to hold people longer than the 1 hour, but there's some important things I'd like to wrap up with if folks are willing to be patient. The witch endures, folks. The witch remains a staple idea in art, in literature, and in religion, as I'll mention just a moment. Here we have an image of Elizabeth Sawyer, who was executed for witchcraft. She's being depicted some significant time after she was executed. And we have the witch appearing in numerous films. The middle film here, The Witch, is an excellent representation of witchcraft fear and anxiety that was produced in 2016 and released today. Is the film The Craft Legacy, which is a remake of a 1997 film, The Craft, which had a really big impact on me. I actually have the vinyl record in my collection. I liked that movie so much. But again, we have the idea of the witch surviving from the early modern period into cinema, and not just into cinema, but inspired by the practitioners of witchcraft in a modern period, in a contemporary period by young people, especially by young women. We have a new film that in fact describes and is actually, they actually hired witchcraft practitioners, modern contemporary witchcraft practitioners, to better make the film more reflective of the kind of witchcraft being practiced by women during this period. As much as witchcraft also survives during this period, so does witch hunting. We have the period here of witch hunting. You see here, this gentleman on the left was actually part of a documentary that was made in the 1980s and 90s for law enforcement during the period of the so-called satanic panic of the 1980s, in which there was an enormous worry around the idea that vast groups of so-called Satanists were killing and torturing children and engaging in all kinds of crimes throughout North America. This penetrated much of law enforcement, and there were very famous cases in the 1980s and 90s in which false accusations were made against numerous people, dozens of people, that they were engaging in Satanism and harming children as a result of their alleged Satanism. This would include the case of the West Memphis Three, and we would also see this even in cases of what is now we would call the QAnon conspiracy, in which what underwrites a great deal of the QAnon conspiracy is that members of the Democratic Party are engaged in widespread Satanism and are in fact torturing and sexually assaulting children in order to get magical power from children. Now, I say that with a straight face, but that is a non-trivial idea that has emerged in American politics to the point in which President Trump has been asked, what does he think about the QAnon idea? And he had to vet an opinion about this. So the idea of witches and witch hunting has survived into 2020, and this remains a terrifyingly lethal reality in post-colonial Africa, in which colonial ideas, white colonial ideas, European colonial ideas about witchcraft were imported into Africa, and now witch hunts are occurring in large numbers in the African continent, specifically in post-colonial sub-Saharan Africa, to terrifying effect. Despite the prosecutions of the witch has won. I'm glad to say the witch is triumphant. Despite the horrifying tragedy and murderous genocide of women during the Middle Ages and the early modern period, the witch has emerged triumphant. Neo-paganism and Wicca, which might be considered a modern interpretation of witchcraft, began in the mid-20th century and has flourished. There are millions of neo-pagans and members of the Wicca religion in the world. There are over 1 million Wiccans in North America alone, specifically in the United States. And even the State Department has recognized Wicca as an official religion, where if you are killed in the line of duty in combat, you can be buried in Arlington Cemetery, for instance, with a pentacle over your tombstone, indicating that your faith is a faith in Wicca and witchcraft. The witch has become a very powerful symbol of feminine power, the resistance to oppression, and the reconnection with a more nature-based spirituality. So Wicca and witchcraft have reemerged as a way of reconnecting in a non-Christian way with the idea of nature and with the idea of pre-Christian spirituality and an exclusively non-male, non-masculine form of spirituality in a way that emphasizes the divine feminine and emphasizes the fertile and fertility notions to be found in nature. So it has become a key element in the development of both second wave and third wave feminism. So witchcraft has become a substantial presence in the new religious movement. There are important studies of witchcraft among religious studies scholars, including myself, and witchcraft is growing at a rapid pace, especially among young people. So we may say, as I begin to conclude the night, and I want to open up for some questions, and you'll forgive me for going a little bit over the 7 o'clock moment, I'd like to announce, and I'm sure as many folks who identify perhaps as witches in the crowd, the witch has won. Despite hundreds of years of prosecution, the image of the witch has been reclaimed by very powerful women and non-male people as a powerful image of triumph over forms of oppression and forms of separation of their spirituality from nature and for pre-Christian forms of religiosity. So we may say that in the terrifying aftermath of the witch trials of the medieval and early modern period, we may truly say that the witch has emerged triumphant. And there is, of course, no better time to celebrate the triumph of the witch than during this year so close to Halloween.